In 1973, a man sat alone in a quiet room in Menlo Park, California, closed his eyes, and claimed to leave his body behind, traveling, in whatever sense that word can mean, to the edge of the solar system. He described rings around Jupiter in precise detail. The scientific community wouldn't confirm those rings existed for another 6 years, when Voyager 1 finally got close enough to see them. That man was Ingo Swann, and the people paying for his sessions weren't a spiritual retreat or a fringe research group. They were, by all available documentation, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States. Now, before you file this away in the drawer marked Conspiracy Theories and Ghost Stories, consider the weight of what that actually means. Not whether Swann was right, not whether he truly traveled anywhere, but the raw, verifiable, declassified fact. One of the most powerful intelligence agencies in the history of modern civilization spent over $20 million across more than 2 decades funding research into whether the human mind could perceive things it had no physical right to perceive. Whether consciousness, that strange, slippery thing you're using right now to read these words, might extend beyond the skull that supposedly contains it. That is the real mystery at the center of this story. Not Jupiter, not the rings, not even Ingo Swann. The mystery is what it means that they tried. Project Stargate, as it came to be known, produced 3 figures whose accounts still resist easy dismissal. Swann, who described a planet no telescope had fully mapped. Pat Price, a former police commissioner who claimed to sketch the interior of Soviet military installations from a chair in California, and Joe McMoneagle, a decorated Army intelligence officer who became remote viewer number 001 and left behind a paper trail that serious researchers still argue about today. 3 men, 3 sets of documented sessions, 3 archives that the CIA eventually declassified and uploaded to its own public database, which is either the most compelling act of transparency in intelligence history or the strangest public relations exercise ever conceived. We're going to go through their cases carefully. We'll look at what they described, what the records say, where the evidence points, and where it quietly dissolves into ambiguity. We'll examine the arguments of those who believe something genuinely unexplained was happening inside those rooms, and we'll sit equally with the arguments of those who see Cold War paranoia, confirmation bias, and the very human tendency to see patterns in noise. But here's the question that will follow us through every piece of evidence, every declassified file, every improbable hit, and every failed session. If the answer is simply that none of it was real, then why does the question of why they kept going for 23 years feel just as strange as if it were? Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. The year is 1972. The Cold War is not an abstraction. It is a lived daily architecture of mutual paranoia between 2 superpowers who have already demonstrated their willingness to end civilization rather than lose. The CIA is not a philosophical institution. It is a machine built for one purpose: gathering intelligence that keeps the United States alive and ahead. Every dollar it spends is, in theory, a dollar accountable to national security. And in 1972, some of those dollars began flowing toward a laboratory at Stanford Research Institute, where 2 physicists named Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff were asking a question that had no business being asked inside a serious scientific institution. Can a human being perceive a remote location using nothing but the mind? Think of it this way. Imagine you have a radio, and you believe the radio is the only thing capable of producing sound in the room. You've built your entire understanding of acoustics around that assumption. Then someone walks in and hums a note, and the walls vibrate at the same frequency. It doesn't disprove the radio, but it suggests that sound, and perhaps the room itself, might be more complicated than your model allowed. The question Targ and Puthoff were asking, the question that eventually became Project Stargate, was whether human consciousness might be that hum, something that moves through the room without requiring the apparatus we assumed was necessary. The mainstream scientific framework of the era had a clean answer: no. Consciousness is a product of the brain. The brain is a physical organ. Physical organs obey physical laws. Therefore, perception without sensory input is impossible, and anyone claiming otherwise is either deluded or dishonest. This is a coherent position. It is still the dominant position in academic neuroscience today, and it is held by serious, careful people with excellent reasons for holding it. But coherence is not the same as completeness, and the history of science is, in part, a history of coherent frameworks being quietly revised when the data stopped cooperating? What if the assumption that consciousness is entirely produced by the brain is itself an assumption, not a proven fact, but a working model that has proven enormously useful and may still be missing something? Not something supernatural, not something that requires abandoning reason, just something unaccounted for. A variable the model hasn't fully incorporated yet. This is not a mystical claim. It is the kind of question that serious philosophers of mind, people like David Chalmers, Thomas Nagel, and Bernardo Kastrup, have been pressing for decades without receiving a satisfying answer from the materialist camp. Targ and Puthoff weren't mystics, they were physicists. And they didn't begin with the conclusion that remote viewing was real. They began with a protocol, controlled sessions, blind judging, statistical analysis, independent replication. They wanted to know if there was a signal worth investigating. What they found, or believed they found, was enough to keep the funding coming for 2 decades. Here's where the story becomes genuinely strange, because it wasn't just the CIA. Over the course of Stargate's life, it involved the Defense Intelligence Agency, Army Intelligence, and a constellation of contractors and consultants who each brought their own agendas and interpretive frameworks to the data. Some believed they were witnessing a real phenomenon. Some believed they were managing a useful fiction that kept the Soviets guessing about American capabilities. Some, almost certainly, weren't sure what they believed. And that uncertainty, institutional, personal, scientific, is the thing that makes Project Stargate worth examining carefully, rather than dismissing quickly. Because the pattern that emerges from the declassified record isn't a story of true believers running an occult program in the basement of American intelligence. It's something more interesting and more disquieting than that. It's the story of serious people, in serious positions, looking at something they could neither explain nor replicate reliably, nor bring themselves to completely abandon, and choosing, again and again, to keep looking. 3 of those sessions belong to Swan, Price, and McMonigal, and they're where the real investigation begins. The first case, Ingo Swann and the Rings of Jupiter. Ingo Swann was not, by any conventional measure, the kind of person intelligence agencies recruit. He was a painter, a conceptual artist with a background in Scientology and a long personal history of what he described as spontaneous out-of-body experiences dating back to early childhood. He was also, according to the documented record of his sessions at Stanford Research Institute, one of the most consistently unusual subjects Targ and Puthoff ever worked with. The Jupiter session of 1973 is the one that refuses to go away. The setup was straightforward by the standards of remote viewing research. Swan was given a set of coordinates, latitude and longitude in space essentially, pointing toward Jupiter, and asked to describe what he perceived at that location. No images, no briefing, no contextual information that would allow him to construct a plausible description from existing knowledge, just the coordinates and whatever his mind produced in response. What he produced included a description of a ring structure around Jupiter. He noted it somewhat tentatively, as if uncertain whether he was perceiving correctly, because at the time no ring had been documented around Jupiter. Saturn had rings, everyone knew that. Jupiter, as far as human observation had established, did not. Swan's notes describe something thin, perhaps not easily visible, but present. In 1979, Voyager 1 passed close enough to Jupiter to photograph it in detail. The images revealed a faint ring system that had never been observed from Earth. It was thin. It was not easily visible. It was there. Now here is where intellectual honesty requires us to pause and hold 2 things simultaneously. The first is that this is genuinely remarkable, not because it proves anything about consciousness or astral travel or the nature of perception, but because the correspondence between Swan's 1973 description and the 1979 Voyager data is specific enough to resist comfortable dismissal. He didn't say Jupiter was big and had storms. He said there was a ring structure. That is a testable claim, and the test, when it came, produced a result that matched. The second thing we must hold is that remarkable correspondences are not proof. The history of psychical research is full of cases where a striking hit is followed by a dozen misses that receive far less attention. Swan gave many sessions. Not all of them produced results as arresting as the Jupiter ring. The question of whether any individual hit reflects genuine anomalous perception or the inevitable occasional accuracy of an imaginative mind operating across a large number of attempts is one that statistics alone cannot fully resolve. because the methodology of the sessions evolved over time, and the standards for what counted as a hit were not always consistent. What the Jupiter case gives us, honestly assessed, is not a proof. It gives us a puzzle. A specific, documented, temporally verifiable puzzle that sits in the record like a splinter, not large enough to change the picture entirely, but persistent enough that pulling it out cleanly has proven for 50 years harder than it should be. There is also this, which is easy to overlook. Swan himself was not entirely comfortable with the framework of astral travel as an explanation for what happened. He preferred the language of perception, that consciousness, under certain conditions, might access information through channels that current science hadn't mapped. He was, in his own way, suspicious of overly mystical interpretations of his own experiences. That nuance tends to get lost when his name appears in headlines. The second case, Pat Price and the Soviet installation. If Ingo Swann represents the cosmic dimension of Project Stargate, the mind reaching toward Jupiter, then Pat Price represents its earthly and deeply operational counterpart. Price was a former police commissioner and city councilman from Burbank, California, a practical man by all accounts, with what he described as a lifelong ability to perceive things at a distance. Where Swann was an artist, Price was an administrator. Where Swann's sessions tended toward the philosophical, Price's were unnervingly tactical. In 1974, Price was given a set of geographical coordinates corresponding to a location in the Soviet Union. He was not told what was there. He was asked simply to describe it. Over the course of several sessions, he produced drawings and descriptions of what he perceived as a large military installation, buildings of specific shapes, underground areas, equipment he attempted to sketch in detail, and the names of personnel associated with the facility, which he claimed to have read from documents he perceived inside the installation. The CIA analysts who reviewed Price's output at the time noted, in internal documents that were later declassified, that certain elements of his description appeared to correspond to a known Soviet facility. The correspondence was not perfect. Some details were accurate, some were not. And the question of how to weight the hits against the misses was one that analysts argued about then and researchers argue about now. But the internal assessment, from people whose professional obligation was skepticism, was that the results were, in their language, not easily explained by chance. Here is where the skeptical case deserves full presentation, because it is a serious one. The phenomenon of cold reading, constructing plausible descriptions of unknown targets based on general knowledge and subtle cues, is well documented. A former police commissioner would have substantial general knowledge of how military installations tend to be organized. The selection of what counted as a hit in Price's sessions was performed by people who were not always fully blind to the target, and the names Price claimed to have read from internal Soviet documents were never independently verified, because the nature of the target made independent verification essentially impossible. That last point is important and cuts both ways. The impossibility of verification protects the remote viewer from definitive debunking, but it also protects the claim from definitive confirmation. We are left, again, in the territory of the plausible and the unverifiable, which is precisely the territory that Project Stargate never fully escaped. What makes Price's case particularly difficult to set aside is not any single session, but the cumulative texture of the record. There are enough specific correspondences across enough sessions, assessed by enough different analysts, with enough different levels of prior belief, to make the dismissive explanation that it was all noise, all coincidence, all confirmation bias, feel slightly too clean to be entirely satisfying. Not wrong necessarily, but clean in a way that reality rarely is. Pat Price died in 1975 under circumstances that some researchers have found suggestive and others have found unremarkable. He was 57 years old and reportedly died of a heart attack in Las Vegas. The file on what he contributed to American intelligence, if anything, remains partially redacted. What he left behind is a body of session transcripts that sit in the CIA's own public archive, available to anyone who wants to read them, resisting easy conclusions in either direction. The third case, Joe McMoneagle and the paper trail. Joe McMoneagle is, in some respects, the most credible figure in the Stargate record, not because his sessions were more dramatic than Swann's or Price's, but because his credentials make the standard dismissals harder to apply. He was not a painter or a former local official. He was a decorated Army intelligence officer, a recipient of the Legion of Merit, a man whose entire professional formation was oriented toward precision, verification, and the disciplined assessment of evidence. McMoneagle became remote viewer number 001, the designation given to the first formally recruited viewer in what would become the military's operational remote viewing program. He participated in sessions over a period of years, and the record of those sessions was subjected to more rigorous blind judging than almost any other body of work produced under the Stargate umbrella. The results, across a large number of trials, showed what statisticians describe as a significant departure from chance. Not in every session, not reliably enough to be operationally dependable, but consistently enough across the aggregate data to require explanation. One of his most discussed sessions involved a target that was later identified as a Soviet Typhoon-class submarine under construction. McMoneagle, working from coordinates and nothing else, described a large vessel, underwater construction, and specific structural features that analysts later compared to the actual design of the submarine. The correspondence, again, was not perfect, but it was specific enough to be taken seriously by people whose professional incentive was to not take it seriously. What makes McMoneagle's contribution philosophically interesting, beyond the individual sessions, is what he has said about the experience of remote viewing from the inside. He has been consistently careful, over decades of public interviews and written work, to resist both the mystical and the dismissive framings. He does not claim to leave his body. He does not claim to travel astrally to distant locations. What he describes is something closer to an anomalous perceptual state, a condition in which certain kinds of information seem to become available through a mechanism he cannot identify and does not fully understand. He is, in other words, a witness who refuses to overclaim, which makes him harder to dismiss than those who don't. He has also been honest about what remote viewing cannot do. It cannot be switched on reliably. It degrades under pressure. It is sensitive to the mental state of the viewer in ways that make controlled replication genuinely difficult. These are not the admissions of a true believer protecting a cherished belief. They are the admissions of someone who encountered something strange and has spent decades trying to describe it accurately rather than palatably. The fourth case, the methodology and its fractures. Beyond the three individuals, there is a fourth dimension of the Stargate story that receives less attention and deserves more. The question of what the program's own internal struggles reveal about the nature of the phenomenon it was supposedly studying. Remote viewing, as practiced under Stargate, was not a unified methodology applied consistently across 2 decades. It evolved, fractured, was revised, was contested from within, and produced internal disagreements that the declassified record captures in striking detail. Some analysts believed the results justified continued operational use. Others believed the program was producing data that looked impressive in individual cases, but dissolved into statistical noise when evaluated rigorously across the full dataset. Some believed the viewers were genuinely perceiving something anomalous. Others believed they were skilled at constructing plausible descriptions that confirmation bias then selected for success. What is remarkable is that these disagreements were never resolved. The program ran for 23 years without producing a consensus about what it was actually observing. That is either a devastating indictment of its scientific legitimacy or a testament to the genuine difficulty of studying something that doesn't fit neatly into existing frameworks, or most likely, both at once. The 1995 evaluation, commissioned by the CIA and conducted by statistician Jessica Utz and skeptic Ray Hyman, produced a result that perfectly captures this ambiguity. Utz concluded that the statistical evidence for anomalous cognition was compelling and would meet the standard for replication in any other field of science. Hyman concluded that the evidence was insufficient and the methodology too flawed to support strong conclusions. Two serious researchers, working from the same data, reaching opposite conclusions. The program was terminated shortly after, officially because the intelligence value didn't justify the cost. Whether the termination reflected a genuine assessment of the evidence or a more bureaucratic calculation about optics and credibility is something the record does not fully answer. The fifth case, what the Soviets were doing. There is one more dimension of Project Stargate that changes the shape of the entire story, and it is the one that tends to be mentioned briefly and then passed over. The Soviets were doing it too. Not in the margins, not as a curiosity, By most available accounts, the Soviet program in psychical research was substantially larger, better funded, and more operationally integrated than anything the Americans produced under Stargate. This is the context in which the CIA's investment makes its most pragmatic sense. The decision to fund remote viewing research was not, or at least not entirely, a decision made by people who believed in it. It was, in significant part, a decision made by people who were afraid that the Soviets believed in it, or worse, that the Soviets had found something that worked, and that America was falling behind in a domain of intelligence gathering it hadn't even named yet. The logic is recognizable from every other theater of the Cold War. You don't need to believe a technology is real to fund research into it if your adversary is funding research into it. That framing does something interesting to the question of whether remote viewing works, because if the program was motivated partly by competitive paranoia rather than genuine conviction, then its existence doesn't tell us as much about what the CIA believed as it tells us about the architecture of Cold War decision-making, the way that uncertainty, in the presence of a perceived adversary, generates its own momentum. The program kept going not because it kept producing definitive results, but because terminating it felt, to the people responsible for the decision, like a risk they couldn't fully justify taking. What that reveals about the relationship between evidence and institutional behavior is arguably more interesting than any individual session transcript. It suggests that the boundary between what an institution believes and what it is willing to fund is considerably more porous than we tend to assume, that serious people in positions of serious responsibility can sustain for decades a productive ambiguity about whether something is real as long as the cost of being wrong about it feels higher than the cost of continuing to look. Here is the thing about a boundary. We tend to imagine it as a line, clean, fixed, the kind of thing you can stand on one side of and know with certainty where you are. Science on this side, mysticism on that side, evidence here, belief there. The history of human knowledge organized as a map with clearly marked territories and a wall running between them. Project Stargate suggests the wall might be a river, not because the sessions of Swan, Price, and McMonigal prove that consciousness can travel to Jupiter, or read documents in Soviet military installations. They don't prove that, and anyone who tells you they do is moving faster than the evidence warrants. But because the existence of the program, its longevity, its institutional seriousness, the quality of the people involved in both conducting and evaluating it, reveals something about the nature of that boundary that the clean map doesn't capture. Rivers don't have edges. They have zones where the land gradually becomes less solid, where the ground underfoot starts to shift in ways you notice only after you've already moved, where the question of whether you're standing on earth or water is genuinely difficult to answer and depends in part on how still you're willing to stand. The men who ran Project Stargate were standing in that zone, and they stayed there for 23 years. Consider what it would take to sustain that position. You would need to be enough of a scientist to care about methodology, replication, and the difference between a compelling anecdote and a statistically significant result. You would need to be enough of an intelligence officer to care about operational utility, cost-benefit analysis, and the consequences of being wrong. You would need to be enough of a pragmatist to keep going when the results were ambiguous, and enough of an empiricist to keep questioning when they seemed clear. And you would need to be willing to hold simultaneously the possibility that you were witnessing something genuinely unprecedented, and the possibility that you were the victim of an enormously elaborate and expensive self-deception. That is not the profile of a true believer. It is not the profile of a debunker. It is the profile of someone standing at a boundary that refuses to resolve itself into a line, someone for whom the honest answer to "is this real?" is not yes or no, but something more like, we don't yet have the tools to answer that question cleanly, and the fact that we don't is itself the most important finding. This is where the story of Project Stargate intersects with something much older than the Cold War. The boundary between what we can measure and what we can only experience has been contested terrain in human thought for as long as human thought has been recorded. The ancient traditions that spoke of consciousness as something more than the body, the Vedantic notion of awareness as the ground of being rather than a product of matter, the Platonic suggestion that the soul perceives truths the senses cannot reach, the Hermetic principle that the inner and outer worlds mirror each other in ways that rational analysis tends to flatten, these were not the speculations of people who lacked rigor. They were the conclusions of people who were doing the best available thinking with the best available tools, and who kept arriving at the same unsettling suggestion that the map of the mind drawn by materialism, however useful, might be missing a significant portion of the territory. Modern neuroscience has given us tools those traditions lacked, and what it has produced is genuinely remarkable. We can watch thought happen in real time. We can identify the neural correlates of experience with increasing precision. We can trace the physical architecture of memory, emotion, perception, and decision with a granularity that would have seemed miraculous to any previous century. And yet the central question, why there is something it is like to be you, why the lights are on, why subjective experience exists at all, rather than a purely mechanical process operating in darkness, remains, by the honest admission of the field's most serious practitioners, entirely open. David Chalmers called it the hard problem of consciousness, not because it is merely difficult, but because it resists, in some fundamental way, the kind of solution that worked for every other scientific problem. You can explain how the brain processes visual information. You cannot yet explain why that processing feels like something from the inside. That gap between the measurable mechanics of the brain and the irreducible fact of experience is the same gap that Project Stargate was, in its strange institutional way, probing. Not with philosophical precision, not with the kind of conceptual care that academic philosophy of mind brings to the question, but with something that academia rarely brings to it. Money, urgency, and the willingness to look empirically at phenomena that the mainstream had decided, largely on theoretical grounds, were not worth looking at. The irony is exquisite and telling. The institution that funded the most sustained empirical investigation into anomalous human perception in the 20th century was not a university philosophy department or a consciousness research center. It was a spy agency. The people most willing to take seriously the possibility that the mind might exceed the brain were not the scientists who had made the brain their professional subject. They were the people whose professional subject was the hidden, secrets, intentions, information that resists conventional methods of acquisition. They were people trained professionally and temperamentally to take seriously the possibility that what cannot be seen by ordinary means might still be real and operationally significant. There is something in that irony that feels less like a coincidence and more like a symptom of how the boundary between science and mysticism actually functions in practice, not as a wall that keeps the irrational out, but as a membrane that the irrational periodically passes through, trailing evidence that is too ambiguous to compel and too specific to completely dismiss. The history of medicine is full of treatments that worked before anyone understood why. The history of physics is full of phenomena that were observed before they were explained, and that looked in the interval between observation and explanation very much like the kind of things serious people should not be wasting their time on. Remote viewing may be one of those things, it may not. The honest position, 50 years after Ingo Swann closed his eyes in a room in Menlo Park and described rings around a planet nobody had photographed yet, is that we do not know. The data is real. The ambiguity is real. The correspondence between his description and the Voyager photographs is real. The methodological problems with the program's evaluation are real. All of it is real, and none of it resolves cleanly into a verdict. What resolves, if anything does, is a different question. Not whether remote viewing works, but what the sustained, serious attempt to find out tells us about the nature of inquiry itself, about what happens when a question is too strange for mainstream science to hold, but too persistent to disappear, about the kind of institution that ends up holding it instead, and what that says about the relationship between knowledge, power, and the edges of what we're willing to believe. The mystics have always said that the most important territory is the one at the edge of the map, the place where the familiar gives way to the uncertain, where the instruments stop working and perception itself becomes the only tool available. Project Stargate was, in its way, a 23-year expedition to that edge. It didn't come back with proof. It came back with something harder to categorize and perhaps more valuable. Evidence that the edge is real, that serious people who go there don't always come back unchanged, and that the question of what lies beyond it remains stubbornly and magnificently open. Ingo Swann died in 2013, Pat Price in 1975. Joe McMonigal is still alive, still careful, still refusing to overclaim. The documents are declassified and sitting in a public database. The rings of Jupiter are still there, faint and real, exactly where Swan said they were 6 years before anyone with a camera got close enough to confirm it. And the question that started all of this, not whether a man traveled astrally to Jupiter, but what it means that the attempt to answer that question attracted the sustained attention and resources of the most powerful intelligence apparatus in human history. That question doesn't have an answer yet. Maybe it's the wrong question. Maybe the right one is simpler and stranger. What does it say about us as a species that we keep standing at that boundary century after century, unable to cross it and unable to walk away? If that question stays with you after this video ends, consider subscribing. This channel doesn't deal in final answers. It deals in the kind of questions that don't let go, the ones that sit at the edge of what we know and refuse to be filed away neatly. There are more of them than you might expect. And the hunt, as always, continues.